Right. Hello, and welcome to this, the latest in our EBIS webinars. And this time we're looking at the outcome of the elections, which, as you know, took place on Sunday in Germany, Europe's biggest country, biggest economy, and one with whom we in Britain always used to have, certainly, very strong relations. I hope we still have, and certainly in Scotland we do. And we're going to consider the outcome, what it means, what happened, and what's next, and what the implications are for Germany, but also for Europe and particularly for Europe as a whole. So joining us from Berlin is to speak on behalf. He's not speaking. Nobody's speaking here on behalf of parties. Let me just make that clear. But Andreas Botsch is the head of the Department for International and European Trade Union Policy at the DGB, the German TIUC. So obviously is quite close to the SPD, which emerged somewhat surprisingly for some, despite the polls in the recent weeks, as the biggest, as the winner, quotes, though the CDU leader Locher has not yet agreed that is the case. Dr. Rainer Ohler is a lawyer and political scientist by training. He's a founding partner at Senior Strategists. He's a former youthful advisor, or as he put it to me, on home affairs in Helmut Kohl's chancellery in 1992 to 1995, when I was the German correspondent of The Guardian. We both lived in Bonn, and he directed communication strategy for many years in the aerospace and defense sectors, Airbus and EADS, amongst others. Nina is it Nina Locher or Locher or Lochi?
Locher.
Locher. Nina Locher, thank you. I should have asked. Is the personal advisor to the president of the Heinrich Böll Foundation, Dr. Ellen Überscher. And again, she doesn't speak for the Green Party, but the Böll Foundation, the Böll Stiftung, is close to the Bündnis 90 Die Grünen in Germany. And she previously worked as a freelance writer, focusing on UK-EU relations and writing the foundation's Brexit blog. So she's eminently well qualified to talk here. She does not speak, as I said, for the Green Party. Dr. Nils Redeker is a policy fellow for European economic policy at the Jacques Delors Center in Berlin. And his work focuses on economic and monetary union, the European single market, and social Europe. And indeed, he got his PhD on the euro and single currency. So there's plenty to discuss. We've had a little chat beforehand. I'm very interested in all of what they have to say, and I look forward to hearing whether, there's been a lot of talk, for example, about the Dutchification of German politics. Is that true? Anyway, over to you, Andreas. You're going to kick off.
Thanks very much, David, and thanks for having me at this EMIS webinar on the outcome of the German elections and possible implications for Europe. Let me start off by saying the outcome of this election will most likely have long-term consequences. At the moment, it's, as you said, David, it's still unclear who will forge a coalition. But one thing is clear, we will see a three-party coalition for the first time in German post-war history. And for the time being, a so-called traffic light coalition is much more likely than Jamaica coalition. And to explain what it means, traffic light is composed of Social Democrats for red, the Green Party for the green, and in the middle, the Liberal Party, FDP, with the yellow light. Jamaica would be Greens, Liberals, and the CDU in the lead. However, this last coalition is very unlikely for the time being because of the disastrous outcome for the Christian Democrats. 16 years of Angela Merkel pays its tribute, and the party is at the brink of a, I'd say, implosion, because people have realized that there is one thing they are aiming at, and this is keeping the power and keep the chancellery for themselves, and very little substance that meets the expectations of the majority of voters. If we're going to get a traffic light coalition, it has become clear from the public statements we've heard on Sunday and since that this will be a coalition that will last longer than just one period. And Olaf Scholz has said it quite clearly. The aim is to forge an alliance that has a longer term perspective. All the three parties have the word progress in their election program. They obviously define it, or everybody their own way, but it's a good start because it's a sign that Germany cannot remain as it has been, which for the majority of the voters was to give a signal that we need progress, we need to move on. We've realized in the pandemic that neither our health system was perfect, that the state of digitalization of the country was one of the worst in Europe. I think we ended one but last in the list of broadband infrastructure. I think the last was just Albania. After 16 years of I would call stable government led by Angela Merkel, it was time for a break, and it was time to move on. Now, as you mentioned, David, I'm not speaking for the Social Democratic Party. I'm a trade unionist myself. I have been for my lifetime. And our relationship with the Social Democratic Party you mentioned, but I would also say our relationship with the Green Party and with its leadership has become really reliable and stable, and we have won very good partners in the party. As to the Liberal Party, there's more to it than just their party president. There's more to it than Christian Lindner, who has told time and again that he was very close to the Christian Democratic Party leader Laschet, and that he would prefer to go into a coalition with the Conservatives. Yet there are more social liberal. I don't recall the name of the party that we saw in Britain in the late 70s, but liberals with a social conscience, I would say. There are more and more of them, and
it was called the SDP.
Yeah, right. Thanks. So there is a prospect, even for the unions, to see a chance and not just a threat to a traffic light coalition. The downside of these elections has been that the former structural majority for the German left is now gone. We have to accept that. There used to be times when SPD, the Greens, and Die Linke, the Left Party, had a majority but never got into a formal government coalition. There's another downside that the radical right, the extremist right, or the neo-Nazis partly, have won in 2 countries, in 2 federal states in Germany, in Saxony and Thuringia. They have come out the strongest, whereas in the West they ended up with a single-digit outcome, which is positive, but there's now a clear divide between parts of East Germany and the rest of the country. In other East German states like Mecklenburg-Vorpommern and Brandenburg, it is different. There the Social Democrats came out the strongest. When I said all parties mention or believe in progress, obviously the notion is very different between the parties, and those who sponsored the election campaign of the Liberal Party expect that the party must now deliver, in particular in tax policy. And we'll see how they can agree. Part of the Liberal election program was really far-reaching in terms of tax cuts for the wealthy and tax cuts for the richest 10%. So in European or sort of international comparison, nothing new about that. They believe in trickle-down economics, and it will be very interesting to see how they agree on the details of future tax and distribution policy. Now, to us, and there we are pretty optimistic, to us, how the shaping of the huge transformation processes that are ahead of us, be it on climate change or be it countering climate change or limiting the consequences of climate change and digitalization, those impacts on the world of work, those impacts are the closest to our heart, and they are even, essential for our own survival. We believe that with a coalition led by Olaf Scholz, we can achieve a lot in terms of infrastructure, in terms of public transport, in terms of energy saving measures, because this is, a transformation process which is very comparable to the one that we have seen in the first industrial revolution, and we are slightly optimistic that we can achieve this with the current state or relation of forces in a potentially future coalition. A brief point about Europe, which I'm sure you're all interested in. Europe has not played a big role in the campaign, not at all. However, on Monday in his first press conference, Olaf Scholz was very much European. He even replied to questions that were posed to him in English from British and American journalists. He even replied in English. And he was asked what he thought about a Schuldenunion. This is a European Union that can issue their own debt and bonds. And he said, look, last year the European reply to the pandemic was we started a European program on short-time work schemes named SURE. That was financed by common bonds, by debt. We started a huge recovery program issued also on the basis of European common debt. And I'm sure he added that in the future, the European Union needs more own resources to become a real sovereign actor on the global scene. So the theme of a sovereign Europe has become big again after the elections, and it is more important what is actually in, not so much important what is in the programs, but much more important what will be in the acts after the election. You know, the traditional Franco-German close relationship will certainly be reinforced with a Olaf Scholz in the Chancellery for a simple reason. All this paradigmatic shift in German policies towards the European Union, which we saw last year, which started in April 2020 as a response to the pandemic, was actually conceived and put together by two people, or by three people. It was Emmanuel Macron and the French Prime Minister, plus the German Vice Chancellor and Finance Minister, who together convinced Angela Merkel that there's no time for ideology, that there is now time for concrete action of all Europeans together. So I'm fairly optimistic, for not to say I'm 100% convinced that Franco-German relationship will be the strongest, will be stronger than before, because both sides have realized that what the future of Europe is in comparison to the systemic competitors, namely China on the east, and to some extent the US to the west, there's only way to go forward, which is to strengthen European unity and to strengthen and to build true European sovereignty. And to Olaf Scholz, social Europe is part and parcel of European sovereignty. Thank you for having me, and I'll stop here.
Thank you very much. I was just about to come in and say thank you very much for that, and to end on a very kind of slightly, upbeat a notion of the kind of strengthening of what we call the Franco-German locomotive or tandem, and indeed around the strategic autonomy, or certainly the strategic Europe concept. Very intrigued. Also very intrigued. We can discuss this hopefully later, about your notion that Scholz is aiming for, as it were, a two-term traffic light, government, which I hadn't heard before. And given the kind of tensions which you admit exist between the FDP, the Liberals, trickle down, and so economics perhaps, and the Greens, now yeah, that's a big ask, is all I could say. Anyway, over to you, Rainer, in Munich. You've said, actually, or you tweeted, correct me if I'm wrong, you did tweet, I think, at one point that this week that you think Scholz should be the Chancellor, and that the CDU, whether under Laschet or somebody else, should go to opposition and renew itself, much like one talked about the Tories doing the same in Britain under the under New Labour, and they now talk about Labour doing the same thing under the continuing Tories, though there isn't much evidence for it. Anyway, so what's your take on all of this, Rainer?
Well, David, thank you for inviting me, and I totally agree with Andreas that there is a little bit of hope that the next government will be, a lot more forceful in driving European topics. We've seen with Angela Merkel, she received a letter, an offer, a proposal by Macron, and she never answered. She had other people to answer. It was a disaster. It was a low point in the Franco-German relations, and I think this will go down in history not as a very good thing. What I would like to say is Olaf Scholz won. Yes, obviously. The Social Democrats just 6 or 12 months ago were, maybe a party of 15, 16, 17, 18% at best. And then, there was this enormous shift towards him. And I think it's a shift towards him, not a shift towards the Social Democrats. I think what we saw in this election was very much, a personality contest. And in this personality contest, Olaf Scholz won because he just acts and looks like the Germans want a chancellor, serious, balanced, tough, years as a finance minister, and not someone, from the Rhineland who, speaks, up and down, and, the Germans don't take it very seriously. Let's be clear. For someone faced with all these complex policies, it is so difficult to take a decision which side is better. Who can fight climate change better? Is it better to fight it with government, or is it better to fight it with technology? Who knows? But everyone can say whether he thinks that a man like Scholz is better in the job as the leader in Germany, or is it Armin Laschet? And clearly this was a personality decision. So I think we need a new slogan. The slogan should be, it's the candidate, stupid. We always thought it's the economy, but I think it's the candidate, it's the personality. And then, the other, I think, quite interesting fact is that, among the first voters, there was a clear split. The strongest group voted for the Greens, I think 23%, and the second strongest, 22%, voted for the Liberal Democrats, which means that neither, the Social Democrats nor the Christian Democrats were attractive to them, and they want change. I think this is the group that really wants change. The rest of the country, doesn't really want change. And that's why we never had change in the last 16 years, because we had 12 years, a grand coalition with a chancellor who thought that change would mean she would lose her majority, and the Social Democrats just didn't want change. So we hadn't seen any reforms since the Schröder reforms. We have not seen anything. We have seen crisis management and administration. And the young generation is now telling Germany basically, we have to do something. Many of my friends in France and in the UK, they use the word inertia. I had never heard it before. I only learned it from them. And indeed, I think for way too many years, Germany has been in a situation of inertia, not doing anything. And this really must change, and this really must come to an end. And I am a Christian Democrat at heart, but I think time for change, and time is now for liberals and the Greens to drive the change and drive the Social Democrats, although they are the stronger party, but by a few percent. They are no longer as strong as they all used to be. So Germany really, from outside, and also for many inside, looks like, on the surface at least, looks like rich and well organized and well fed, and the economy running well, unemployment hardly any, quite a lucky country, with where life is easy and good. But when you really look into it, a lot of these things are only true on the surface. We have the highest electricity prices. We emit more CO2 coming from coal than ever before. And the next few years, we will do it even more because we have basically we've taken the wrong steps in our energy policy. We were not consequential enough. We were unable to deliver on the promises of what we call the energy change. And because we are not able to build as fast as one needs to, build lines from the north to the south, because it takes forever to get building permits, and the procedures are way too long. The Berlin airport disaster that is known around the world is not a local thing. I think the Berlin airport disaster gives you a clear view where a lot of the German problems are. It's our bureaucracy and the incompetence in certain, politically driven areas. And these are the things that we really need to overcome. So, I think I stop here because there's a lot that we can further discuss in the Q&A, and I don't want to give too much of a speech at this point.
Okay, well, yeah, but that was very, very interesting, extremely interesting indeed. And obviously, it's a lot different from what the great kind of grandmaster, as it were, of the CDU, Konrad Adenauer, said, which was, one of his big slogans when he was Chancellor was always kind of experimenter. And actually what you're suggesting is that Germany may well be ready for, at the very least, some form of experimenter. So that brings us neatly onto Nina, who can talk about, because I'm very intrigued by this idea of change, Erneuerung, renewal in English, and and actually what you refer to yourself. I mean, a lot of Germans have been very, very close to and want stability, i.e., no change, and the stability. I can remember going to the a jubilee at the Bundesbank, and every single speaker said it was like a church service. It said Stabilität, Stabilität, Stabilität. It was extraordinary. It was like a kind of Bach cantata, being sung there. It was actually took place.
It means status quo.
Yeah, exactly.
That's
the status
quo really
quo.
means.
Exactly. So and it actually took place. The event took place at the Pauluskirche, which was kind of like St. Paul's Church in Frankfurt. So maybe that was out. Anyway, so the question, for you, Nina, is can the Greens, or the Green sort of, the traffic light coalition, if that's what we're talking about, can it enact? Can it be stable enough and at the same time drive forward this, the change that both Andreas and Rainer are asking for and talking about?
Thank you for your question. Also, thank you for the invitation, and hello to everyone again. I work for the Heinrich Böll Foundation, which is close to the Green Party. So maybe I can give a bit of the insights and go a step back and talk about how I think from a Green perspective, you could look at the elections first. Obviously, regarding the coalition talks, I think for now, none of us can really make predictions yet, but I think there's a big will for change. That's something Andreas also said. But also like going back and looking at the elections from like a more distant point, I think the Greens started their campaign saying we want change, we want renewal. And when you look at the elections from a Green point of view, the Greens definitely had hope for more. So even though the Greens are the party that basically, they didn't double their results, but it's the party that had the biggest gains within the federal elections, it's still within the Green Party looked at something semi-successful, I would say. Because obviously the goal was to get Annalena Baerbock as the Chancellor. That's something the Greens hadn't reached. But yeah, so I think that's something definitely to recognize and something that the party itself will have to work on in the future. But one interesting perspective you could see in the elections is that the German party system also has two votes. I learned similar to the Scottish parliamentarian election as well. So with the first vote, you can basically use the first past the post system to get one direct candidate into parliament, and the Greens increased their direct share from 1 delegate to 16 delegates. And that's something very interesting when you look at the party system, because usually using the majority vote, you would expect the more established parties, the bigger, for example, Social Democrats and Christian Democrats, to get most of these votes. And that's something you see both in the Green Party and the Left Party that you also mentioned before. So I think this is a sign for a more pluralized party system that we will be having in Germany in the future. Yeah, and I think even though the Greens probably haven't reached their expectations, I think there's one historic turning point that we also have to recognize, is that for the first time in history, we have had 3 candidates for chancellorship, and for the first time, we have had a Green female candidate for the chancellorship. And it gives a big sign towards the question, or it basically shows the Greens have the expectation and also are able to assume the responsibility to take political leadership of one of the biggest economies in Europe. And I think that's something to recognize, something that we have never seen in a different European country as well. One other point I would want to make, because Andreas, you also mentioned the AfD, or the rights extremist party in Germany, is yes, we have had gains in Eastern Germany especially, but in total, I think we also have to recognize that it has been a democratic, fair and respectful political competition. And I think that's something we should never take for granted, also looking at countries like Hungary or Poland that basically also move back from their liberal to illiberal democracies. Another point I wanted to make is looking at the party political landscape, you also mentioned that we will most likely be having a 3-party coalition. I mean, the Great Coalition is still an option. I don't think that both of Social Democrats and Christian Democrats really see it as an alternative. I see Andreas shaking his head. But this also means that in future, we will need more compromises. We will need more understanding of each other's policies. We also need more fights maybe in Parliament. But we need to create a common ground for modernization that brings differences together to create something new, rather than just looking for the smallest denominator. And that's something German political parties also really like to do, to say like, okay, you want to cut the tax for the rich. We basically want to increase them, so then we just can't work together. And that's something that's not going to work again. That's not going to work anymore in future. And I think that's something really important to recognize as well. That's also, because you mentioned this at the beginning, David, that's also why the Liberals and the Greens have started to talk pre-coalition, exploratory talks before they even join official talks, because, and I don't know if all of you have followed German politics 4 years ago, it was one of the reasons why the Liberals 4 years ago left the coalition talks, saying, okay, we don't want to join a coalition with the Greens and the Christian Democrats. And that's one result we get out of it, to say, if we have 2 parties that are the furthest away, maybe they should find a common ground first before we actually start talks that are more serious. So I think this is a very interesting result we find, because the smaller parties actually have a de facto veto power about which coalition we will be having in the future. Yeah, I think when you look at the issues, I think at least from a Green perspective, climate change and climate protection definitely had a big relevance in the political competition. It's something we have never seen before when you look at the scale. We also see, compared to 2017, we see that the word climate in all party programs doubled, like no matter which party you actually look at. So not even only the Greens, but also the Christian Democrats, Social Democrats. So we see that's actually an issue that drives all parties forward. And when you also look at the Liberals and the Greens, I think you have a common ground in saying, okay, we need climate neutrality. I think the question is how you get there. Which way do you decide to take to get there? And I think that's where you find the difference. But the goals actually are similar. I think it's not a question anymore that we actually do need climate neutrality. One other issue that I think wasn't really visible in the campaign, which I think was very interesting, was the question of gender. I think question of gender and identity, I think what in Germany is called identity politics. I would have expected it to be a lot more visible and to be a lot more polarized. And that's also one thing we can see in the election results, is that the new parliament will be more female, it will be more diverse in many different dimensions. And I personally also, as a young woman, young white woman, I think for me that's a great success to see, also a great success that the Greens have brought forward. For example, we see an increase of gender parity. I mean, it's not gender parity, but an increase from 30 to 34% of female politicians in parliament. We see an increase of people with migration background from 8 to 11%. So there's still there's still a long way to go. I think it's comparable also to the House of Commons when you look at the numbers. But it's definitely something we should also be recognizing. And as a political symbol, for example, we have the 2 first trans women in parliament. We have the first Black woman of color. We have the first woman with a visible disability. So I think these are very important political symbols to show that political representation matters, and that it also has a significant effect on how we actually want to shape policymaking in future. So yeah, that's one point really important I wanted to make. Let me finish with a look to Europe and foreign policy. You already mentioned that European policy actually did not play any role in the elections or in the political campaigning beforehand. I think one possible explanation for this could be that the parties that actually won are all very similar in being very pro-European. And I think that's something also looking to British politics that we also, I mean, shouldn't be taking for granted, but it's also something where you had a lot of common ground to say, okay, yes, we are all committed to the European Union. And again, we are different in how we want to shape the European Union in future, but nobody except for the AfD really talks about leaving or about getting out, going stuff back. And I think also to finish with a Green perspective, I think what's really important for the new government to come is that the European Union now has to be at the center stage of coalition talks to say, okay, if we want a German government, we need it to be European, and we need it to be a driving force within the European, also with regards to climate policy, because that's something that the German government actually didn't do in the past. So the German government usually was one of the actors at the European level that actually stopped or slowed down processes regarding the European Green Deal, regarding different climate packages. And I think that's something that the European Union also really needs to say, okay, Germany is one of the biggest countries, and Germany also needs to lead these talks that look into the future. So with that note, I think I would end, and I'm interested to hear what Nils has to say.
Anyway, well, thank you very much indeed, for that tour d'horizon, and raising, quite a lot of very important eyes, particularly at the end. I think will be music to the ears of quite a lot of folk, that you would like to see Germany kind of playing this very positive, a much more kind of dynamic role within, leadership role effectively within Europe, because Europe has got a hell of a lot of problems, as we know, and, is going to have to deal with it. So this leads very nicely into, of course, our next speaker, who has to unmute himself, Nils Redeker from the Jacques Delors Center in Berlin. So the Jacques Delors Center must be a Franco-German, strategic entity. So anyway, give us your views, Nils, on what the outcome of the election means particularly for kind of the European economy, European economic and fiscal policy, and all the other things, but that without necessarily going into all the nuts and bolts of the capital markets union, which I think would suddenly see most of our participants leave.
Okay. I'll stay away from that. But thank you very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here, and I already find this discussion quite fascinating. I want to do 3 things. First, just cover a bit on ground where we are right now in terms of politics. Second, what would this new coalition maybe mean for German macroeconomic policy? Which is, I think, a topic that is, from a European perspective, always very important. And then also look a bit into speculating what this might mean for European economic policy, especially on fiscal rules and on climate policy. So starting with where we are right now, what's the status quo? I think I'm following all of the speakers before me and thinking that the traffic light coalition now is the most likely outcome. Now we are not completely there yet, the Jamaica coalition is still an option. I think mainly because all the parties except for the SPD have an interest in Jamaica still being an option. It's a good bargaining chip for both the FDP and the Greens. Not to rule that out right now. It also makes sense, at least from Lush's perspective, to have this as an option for the foreseeable future. So I think it's going to stay on the table, but given the public mood and who won the election and which parties gained, I think we're really narrowing down on a traffic light coalition. I think the main challenge now is going to be to find a positive narrative for this coalition. And there's a real will to do so, right? Especially for the Greens and FDP. For two reasons, I think mainly because last time this didn't work out during the Jamaica coalitions in 2017, the negotiation talks there. I think these two parties really understood that it can't be the case that you have a three-party coalition and then you have two parties that really agree on stuff, and then you have one party that kind of like plays the role of the corrective. You have to find a common ground, have a positive narrative. And given where we are with the German political system now, it's also very likely that that many future governments will involve both the Greens and the FDP. So it makes a lot of sense for these two parties to try to find common ground, and it's difficult. Because they are on the opposite side of the spectrum, especially when it comes to a lot of economic policy. But it's something that they'll try to figure out now in the coming weeks. But I think the main, from a European perspective, one of the main concerns was that we are going to be in a limbo for months and months and months now, with everything that's going on at the European level. You won't have a stable German government. This can still happen, but given how things are moving right now, I wouldn't be surprised if it actually works out that we have a German government in December. I think we're quite there. So what would this traffic light coalition mean for economic policy? Let me start with macroeconomic policy in Germany. I think without going into the details, I think the main gist could be that you could expect Germany to be much more expansive than before when it comes to fiscal policies, right? So the German government, the Green Party has suggested a big spending program, public spending on infrastructure, on housing, on energy, on green innovation. I think about 50 billion per year for the next 10 years. The Social Democrats want more public spending as well. They haven't put a number onto it, but they are kind of on board with that. And then, of course, the FDP, the Liberals, it's not a big government party, but it's also not campaigning on austerity, right? So Andreas already mentioned that one of their main policy agendas was big tax cuts, and they would amount to almost like 70, depending on how you would calculate that, they could amount to 75 billion in tax cuts per year. So this is also not going to work if you would want to try to implement austerity. So I think it's quite likely that we're going to see some form of a compromise that is going to involve some public infrastructure spending, a bit of tax cuts, especially a lot of tax cuts on write-offs, on company investments, on green and digital stuff, and then maybe also a bit on the minimum wage. But I would actually expect this government to be much more on the expansive side when it comes to fiscal policies than the previous ones. How is this going to work? Well, we still have the German debt brake, which is always a big topic in the European debate. I don't think we are going to reform this. It's enshrined in the German constitution. To get rid of it, you would have to have a 2/3 majority
Right. So could you just explain to the viewers what the debt brake is?
Sure.
You say it's anchored in the constitution, but it's not a concept we are familiar with here.
Sure. So the debt brake was introduced in 2009, and it's a fiscal rule that obliges the German government not to run a bigger deficit than 0.35% of GDP, not more than the structural deficit can't be bigger than that in any given year if you are not under special circumstances right now as we are under crisis. So this has been a big debate from a European perspective because it kind of binds German economic policy. I don't think this is going to be reformed, but I'm very optimistic that the next coalition will find ways around this. There are already ideas about a special investment fund that would operate outside of the German budget, that wouldn't fall under the debt brake, but could still like leverage a lot of investment that I think most of the parties that are now in question for government really want that investment, including actually both trade unions and also the business side, I guess. So I think in terms of macroeconomic policy, we can expect more expansion. What does that mean for European economic policy? I think two things are on the agenda right now. The first is a reform of European fiscal rules. There's a big concern in Europe that the fiscal rules, which are off the table for now, given the corona pandemic, are going to be reinstated in 2023. And this might force a lot of European countries into quite a tight austerity path. And there was a lot of debate before the German election whether this could be changed, whether the reforms could happen under a new German government. So I think one of the upsides, because many now mentioned that Europe was not a big topic in the elections, and this was not a big topic in the election at all. The fiscal rules on the European level, which is bad if you think in terms of politics, or if you don't have a democratic debate about this. The good thing is that it also kept, especially the liberals, from making grand statements on having to avoid a transfer union, having to avoid a debt union. So it kind of went under the radar, which gives a bit of more leeway now for the coming months. Does that mean that we are going to see major reform? Andreas was quite optimistic. I'm not 100% optimistic. I think Scholz already during the election alluded to the fact that he finds the Stability and Growth Pact and the fiscal rules are working fine on the European level. It would be extremely hard to reform them anyway, given the positions of other governments. So I would expect there to be much more of a muddling through approach. I don't think that the German government is going to push towards like full-fledged reinstating the rules from 2023 onwards. But I think the most likely outcome is that they're going to push over the issue to the European Commission. There are some ways in which these rules can be applied quite flexibly, so that it wouldn't enforce consolidation, too much of a consolidation path on countries like Italy and Spain. But I don't see really, especially with the liberals in government, a big push for a grand reform on the European level, especially when it comes to fiscal rules. Maybe Andreas has a different ideas on that, but so I would think it's more likely to have a muddling through approach on that. And then finally on climate policy and the Fit for 55 package, I think this is the next big thing on the European agenda. And the big question at the moment there is especially the question of the emission trading system that the European Commission proposed now as part of the deal, a new emission trading system that now would include especially transport and heating. Right, this was outside of the emission trading system, and the Commission wants to put it in there now. I think there it's important to understand that what the Commission is proposing at the moment is very close to a system that Germany introduced at the beginning of this year. And it's very much disliked in much of Southern Europe, especially now with the energy prices soaring in many of these places. So we are going to see a lot of opposition. The one thing I would think when we have a government that includes the FDP and the Greens, you will have a big champion for that system sitting in Germany, because the Greens like that system. And carbon pricing is the one big climate agenda policy point that the liberals have on the agenda, and this could become really an issue or a negotiation point at the European level, where the next German government could really push for introducing this as a main agenda topic. I will leave it at that, and I'm very much looking forward to the discussion.
Sorry, yeah, I had to unmute myself. Thank you very much, Nils. I find this astonishing, actually, because there is a kind of degree of dynamism and energy in this discussion, which I think would be pretty well impossible in the UK at the current conjuncture. And also, frankly, there seems to be an extraordinary. I mean, I'd be just before we move on to the Q&A proper. I'd be intrigued to know if you agree actually on this. You seem to be all, you know, all four of you seem to be kind of rather singing from the same hymn sheet. Is that right? I mean, is it in terms of, you know, the possibility for change, the possibility for change in Europe? I mean, just basically, you know, there's a kind of like a sense in which this, it's a bit like after the kind of, you know, you know, now that the German football team is null, you know, maybe the German economy is going to be, and the you know, German politics are going to, you know, going to be sort of leading ahead now, and we're going to see kind of big changes not only in Germany but elsewhere in Europe following suit. What do you think, guys?
If I may start, David.
Yes, of course.
It's almost a Quaker meeting, as you were tweeting. There's still one or two points I'd like to qualify in what my predecessors said. I mean, Rainer at one point mentioned that the Greens and the FDP should be driving the Social Democrats towards reform. I think, I mean, my reading of the election program of the Social Democrats was not so much that all we want is stability and we want no change, but the proportion of change or the areas of change were slightly different from those of the Liberals or the Christian Democrats. So I think to keep a sense of proportion, we should not expect the tail wagging the dog, but both parties, Greens and FDP, taken together have almost the same proportion of votes than the Social Democrats. They're, I think, 1 percentage point, almost 1 percentage point better in the outcome than the SPD. So this is just to dampen perhaps expectations. The other question that Nils mentioned in terms of the European implications or the implications for European economic policy, where he thought that I was perhaps a bit too optimistic. I think there will be a new sense of pragmatism as far as Europe is concerned. And I've known Olaf Scholz for many, many years to know and to tell you that when he says that the Stability and Growth Pact has worked fine, that in this perception he included also the total break of the Stability and Growth Pact last year. What he says it's of course if you need to do things, it's almost the Keynes quote from I think 1946. Whatever we really want to achieve, we also can finance. This is roughly what Keynes said. And I see Olaf Scholz's European policy. I mean, he has been advocating a European unemployment reinsurance system to help balance national social security systems when a country is in a crisis and so on. I think what he says is we need some flexibility, which we have seen last year, and this flexibility can either be achieved by introducing something like a golden rule, both in to the national accounts of German national debt, but also common European debt. So common European debt is no longer sort of the elephant in the room, and no longer the worst thing that could ever happen to us. And I think it's, to some extent, it is progress that used to be blocked by the post-Helmut Kohl Christian Democrats, who were rather ideological, and I do not see as much resistance within the Liberals. If I may,
I was just going to say, I think because we got quite a few questions, so can you just wrap it up, Andreas?
Yeah, I was going to answer to one of the questions in the Q&A, which was about the young people. I mean, German demographics have meant that only 8% of the voting population is now 24 years old or younger. And actually the relative majority is now 60 years or older, which is that the older generation is definitely in the driving seat. So for younger people to really make a difference, they will have to make an impact like Fridays for Future, going to the streets and demonstrating for policy to stop climate change. So it's not. This is a peculiar situation in Germany, but I think the younger have their means to become heard or to be heard, but they're no longer in a demographic relative majority.
Okay, I was very interested because Nina, there's a couple of questions precisely on this. I mean, well, so one person Alan makes a comment actually that that young voters in Scotland do vote in large numbers, and they're energized by climate change and Scottish independence. So a lot of young people, basically, huge numbers of young people in Scotland vote SNP or Green, particularly including the latter. And Marianne is asking a question: why and how did the Greens manage to get new members elected in the first the direct mandate, first constituency vote? Is there something that the Green parties in the UK can learn from the Greens in Germany? And if so, what is it? Or you could talk about answer the other questions as you go along too.
I haven't read the questions because I listened. So if there's other questions I should answer, you probably have.
No, just okay. the question I asked at the start about whether you agree that actually, I mean, all four of you agree that they'll more than likely, I'm absolutely quasi certain there's going to be a traffic light coalition in government, whether it lasts 4 years or 8. That's another question, But is there a sort of sense of energetic change, given that, as Andreas has pointed out, the kind of biggest demographic in Germany is people of my age, pretty well. As oldies, pensioners, die Grauen.
I would say with regards to the young voters, I think what's really interesting is when you look at the Scottish independence referendum, or when you look at the first referendum, 2014, if I'm not mistaken, was the first time that people from the age 16 were able to vote. So you saw a huge increase of people age 16, 17 voting for Scottish independence, also voting, for the independence referendum. And I think it also shows the importance of the young people having a say and giving their vote to questions that will shape their future. They will shape their future more than it will shape any other people's future. And that's also something you would see in when you look at the surveys. I mean, in Germany we still have the right to vote from the age 18, so there's a whole chunk of people that is excluded from the voting procedure. And I think also when we talked about how could a traffic light coalition really work in practice, I think it would be one project that would be, in my opinion, pretty realistic, that the Social Democrats, the Liberals and Greens could put forward to say, okay, let's decrease the age of people voting for the elections to actually give them a say for their own future. And I think that's something, when you look at Fridays for Future, when you look at the Constitutional Court that just voted the climate law unconstitutional, I think there's many signs where you see that the young people actually need to be able to have an influence on how their future will be shaped, because they will be the ones in the end carrying the burden of, for example, climate change. So I think that's a really interesting part. You also asked the question of how the direct candidates were won. So I think I mentioned the pluralization of how votes were gained in different sectors. What you see is that the Greens won, especially in urban areas. So I think that's also a question that the Greens should take forward, is to ask how can you also reach people in rural areas. But you see that, for example, in Stuttgart, in Berlin, in Hamburg, in Aachen, there's different cities where the Greens were able to win the majority of the cities. And then you have the combination of young people moving to cities, then basically having cities where climate policy is also something that's very immediate. So for example, in cities, I think when you look at local actors, there's a lot of things that can change on a practical level. And I think maybe it's how sometimes I have the feeling that it's a way of bringing climate policy forward to the practical lives of people. So I think that's something we could take forward. I just wanted to also refer to Nils regarding the debt break. Just to add one note on that, because you said that you don't see it being realistic that the debt break will change. One thing that the Greens demanded, and I think that's something that we will see in future in the coalition talks, so I'm not sure how they will agree on that, because the Greens actually demand what we call black zero, so the debt break having zero debts, to expand that to a green zero. So for the Green Party, that actually means, okay, yes, we will keep the debt break, but we will have an exemption for investments that are directed towards climate neutrality. And I think that's something, if we actually want to take climate policy and energy transition seriously, we do have to invest, and we do have to think climate, economy, industry, social policy together. And I think I think then you also actually need investments in this.
So from the golden rule to the green rule, if you like to put it that way.
Basically.
Anyway, yes, Rainer.
David, just a few little remarks. One about the Greens winning direct mandates. It's really interesting to look at that. In Munich, they won Munich South. And Munich South is probably one of the districts with the highest proportion of SUVs, Porsches, Ferraris, and the likes. Yeah. So clearly, the Green Party, is a favorite among certain types of people and classes in the country. We have to recognize that. Not sure there is so much that one can learn about this, but it clearly shows that this is not only a movement of a certain class. It is the Green Party is able to attract quite a number of people in certain areas.
Yeah.
Where I disagree a little bit with Nils is that I'm a little more optimistic than you about the fiscal policy. If they really want to go for the traffic light coalition, if they really want to go for 2 terms at least, then they have to look a little bit beyond the horizon. And the topics of the euro, the debt issues, and all of these topics, they cannot be postponed forever. The muddling through will not work. There will come a point where the issues will have to be addressed. And I think Corona basically gave a framework of running the first test cases. We have to complete the euro. It really has to become a fully fledged currency, which is not the case yet. And it's largely because some countries in Europe are not ready to do the structural changes and reforms that are necessary. And Germany, doesn't want to pay for the Club Med, as they say. So this has to be bridged. And I think only, a coalition of the kind that we are seeing now can actually overcome that if they have the political will to do so. And if they don't have the political will right now, I'm sure in the next 5 years, they are going to get into a crisis at some point where they have to address it. And I think it's, if they come with, let's muddle through this, they will be hard hit at a later stage. They should better try to think about it and move on with that.
Okay.
Another question that I would like to answer with just one sentence is, because it's often asked, will there be any change coming from the outcome, whoever is going to be the government in Germany in the relation to the UK? I think on that topic, I think we need to be clear no, because there is a wide consensus among all parties on the view of the UK, and it's a very sad view, unfortunately. I think that mostly when it comes to all the negotiations, everybody will push it to Brussels because nobody wants to deal with it. And so I don't think that there is hope for, whatever government Germany brings up for any change. The change actually must come from the other side. Okay.
Right, thank you very much. Is there Alex is asking a question about, given that the CDU-CSU effectively has been in trial for 16 years, are there examples of policy that maybe now be possible that weren't possible with a left-leaning coalition? And Sarah adds, what policies are we likely to expect from the coalition regarding nuclear energy? Are we sticking to the timetable to shut nuclear plants by 2022?
Unfortunately, yes, because there is nobody who is ready and would volunteer to continue running them. There is nobody in the industry who would carry the stick further. It was a major political mistake, I would say. Our decision of 2011 to, from one day to another, change policy because of the disaster in Japan was, when it comes to stupidity, on the level of Brexit, if I may say so. Because now, we are in trouble. We want to shut the coal mines, but then we don't have enough energy. Now we have to import the energy. We're going to import energy from France, nuclear, and from Poland, coal. So this was very stupid. We should have done it the other way around. I think at the end, going out of nuclear is probably the right decision. But the way it was done in Germany, and without having the ability to bring the energy that comes through the wind turbines from the north into the south where it is needed, I think we shot ourselves into the knee. So it shows that stupidity is certainly something that the Germans can do a lot.
Of course. There's another question from Bill actually about will there be any change in Germany's decision on Russia, where you're heavily dependent on Russian gas, and in particular, Nord Stream 2 is pretty well built, but in fact it is built. And will it definitely go ahead? Will there be any change in policy there?
If I may come in on
Yeah.
just on the last point, the examples of what can now change after 16 years of Merkel.
Yeah.
Surprisingly enough, one of the biggest stumbling blocks in terms of change has been the ministry that should be normally in the driving seat for reforms, and that's the economics ministry. The regulation that they see is, or that they have pursued, was not really incentivizing a lot of change. And a good example is that they did not oppose moves from the regional governments in some of the German lenders that imposed minimum distance rules between the elevation of a windmill and any kind of human settlement. It wasn't just cities or villages, but as soon as there was just a single farm or a single house, they called it settlements, and then you needed 1 kilometer or 1.5 kilometers distance for the next windmill. And if you look at the landscape of Germany, it is almost impossible to find a spot for a windmill, leave aside a full park of windmills. So in terms of renewable energy, the CDU was blocking everything, including at Länder level. and I believe this is probably one of the examples where a new start is really possible.
Andreas, if I may add to this, it was not only this policy, which I agree needs to be revised, but then the inability to build the lines from north to the south, which was clearly blocked by those who don't want to change laws, because for that we need to change the law. And this was definitely opposed by the Social Democrats, with the result that the Green Prime Minister of Baden-Württemberg was only able to build a handful of windmills in Baden-Württemberg. So there's really a lot to do when you really look at it, and this is coming from all sides.
Okay.
Right.
Can I just
Nord Stream?
What?
Russia and Nord Stream?
Yeah. Quick, very briefly. Yes or no?
I believe the appeasement policy towards Russia will become a bit more shaky. And not just in terms of Nord Stream, where I personally find it scandalous, absolutely scandalous, that the former German Chancellor has now become, the clown or the paid
Mr. Gazprom.
Mr. Gazprom, the paid lobbyist for Putin. Nord Stream is most likely going to be finished, but how much gas, if at all, will flow through the line is very uncertain.
Well, that's a very interesting answer. Thank you. Nils first, and then Nina. Unmute, Nils.
Yes. Now,
that's it.
So put 2 points. The first on what kind of policies are more likely to come now. I think this is really where like the fiscal policies is the one area where I see there's more room now that there would have been with the CDU and government. The big difference between the FDP and the CDU on fiscal policy is that the CDU really has made the black zero their running horse, which basically means no debt. The FDP just wants to keep the debt brake in place, and you can find ways around the debt brake. It's much easier to find ways around the debt brake than it is around the aim of the black zero. And second, I think also on questions surrounding Europe, it's easier now to find compromises on economic policy. And there I wanted to get back to Andrea and Rainer, Andreas and Rainer. So I do think that. So first of all, I would never underestimate the amount of muddling through that is possible in the European Union. I think that we could have given the same speech on it. It can't go on like that 10 years ago, and we all would be surprised on like how little has changed in terms of like really institutional change surrounding the euro. And this is of course now leaving aside the recovery instrument and the RRF and everything else. I do believe that there can be some changes in the longer run, but I think we have to admit that this would mean major compromises between SPD and Greens and the FDP. The FDP is really on the opposite spectrum of this, and you might find these compromises, but I'm just not very optimistic that there's anyone willing to spend the political capital now that it would take to bridge these differences, simply because this is going to be a shaky coalition in the beginning, right? There are huge differences in many areas, and the question is, so in terms of coalition agreement, I would, for example, not assume the more general it gets and the less specific it gets in the coalition agreement on European economic policy, the more happy I am. Because that leaves the possibility to kick the can down the road a bit and then see next year or the year afterwards what kind of policy reforms are possible. I don't see there's going to be a grand change for that just right now, especially at the beginning of this new government.
Okay, thank you. Nina?
I wanted to react to both of the questions on nuclear energy and Nord Stream 2. So I think it's no surprise that I fully disagree with Rainer. I think it was the best decision ever to shut down the nuclear energy plants. I mean, they won't open again. There was no discussion on it in the election campaign. in my opinion, it's very important that it has not been opened again. Nuclear energy is both environmentally, with regards to foreign policy, and economically, it's not sustainable. So now, even now that we, as like Germany, has shut down nuclear plants much earlier than other countries have, and we have a huge problem with nuclear trash. There's no, I mean, there has been a discussion going on where the trash would go. We see huge nuclear energy trash exports to especially development countries. So there's a lot of also power shifting, or I mean, not power shifting, but like using the use of power in industrialized countries also to export the nuclear trash that they don't really know what to do with. There's various studies that show that nuclear energy economically isn't really sustainable because it has a huge amount of fixed costs at the beginning when you implement them, and then when you look at climate neutrality, there's no really, like, it's not like, we already know that they won't, you know, it won't be a sustainable investment into a longer future. And then also with regards to energy supply, you see that we actually have an oversupply already of renewable energy. So I don't know how familiar you are with the European energy system, but actually what happens is in let's say windy times, Germany actually has an oversupply of renewable energy and actually gives renewable electricity, for example, to Poland for free, also mixing up the Polish energy market because they can't get rid of the energy itself. So we know that in many times we actually don't need any conventional energy sources anymore already, even though we're not fully there yet. Like, we know, I mean, we need time for transition also with regards to coal, the exit of coal, but with regards to nuclear energy, I think it's like we don't need it, and it's very good that it's going, like, that we will shut them down in next year. And then 1.2 Nord Stream 2, I think it's one of the topics where I'm most skeptical about when you look at the coalition talks, especially between the Greens and the Social Democrats, because that's actually one part where the Greens and the Liberals have a lot of common ground, like also compared to the Social Democrats. I think it's no surprise, or it's no secret, that the Social Democrats have very close ties to Gerhard Schröder and Gazprom. And I mean, we've talked about this. And on the other hand, the Greens also promote, and that's one big part in the Green Party program, or in the Green Party program, is that we have to move towards a value-based foreign policy, to say, okay, if we want foreign policy, if we want relationship with Russia, also with China, it needs to be based on standards of environmental protection and human rights. And that's something, especially with Russia, we have seen exploding, or we have seen an increased escalation in the last weeks before the Duma elections that basically happened just 1 week before the German elections. So for us, as for example, the Heinrich Böll Foundation, we also increasingly have partners we can't work with anymore because they are shut down. They are basically declared as unwanted organizations. And I think we can't, on the one hand, have an energy-based partnership and say, okay, we'll take your gas from you, and then also create dependencies. On the other hand, we basically are not able to work on civil society level with them anymore.
Okay, thank you.
That's my 2 cents.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. Yeah, there's a question. I mean, we haven't got very long, so I'm going to rattle through. If you just, maybe one of you could answer this one. And that is, Kenny's asking a question, which is very interesting for those of us who were around in 1989, 90 as well, like me, in other words. Now, he points out there's geographic as well as a demographic difference in the appetite for change amongst German people, and a different view of any direction of change was desirable. So how will the Ampelkoalition, the traffic light coalition, deal with the lender with the old name, the new lender, where AfD, quotes, won the election, and where people are pretty pissed off or unhappy with the Große Koalition, let alone any willingness to go for the experiments of the traffic light coalition? I mean, it's very clear that they did the outcome. This is being suggested, for example, in the FT today, that somewhere, that the traffic light coalition is a coalition for West Germany and not for East Germany. Discuss. Anybody?
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
not, you know, there's difference between East and East. You see Berlin, then Brandenburg, roundabout Berlin, and
Yeah.
the north is very much painted in red. So almost all direct candidates with their first vote have come from the Social Democratic Party. There's only two parts of East Germany where the AfD has become number one. That is Saxony and Thuringia. And the other small part, Saxony-Anhalt, is mixed.
Yeah.
So it's not really a West German coalition, but you know, Saxony is a very special case. I'd like to find an answer to all my questions I have about these people.
Yeah.
I'm afraid I can't.
All right, thank you. And just one last one before I go. I've got to have one final say from Bill, who says that Mark Carney, you know, the former governor of the Bank of England and governor of the Bank of Canada, has argued that the approach to tackling climate change mitigation will be through regulation to restructure the commercial incentives so as to align the business community with social imperatives. Is that enough of a basis for an FDP Green working relationship? Nils?
So like, I have no insights in the inner working of these inner workings of this party. But I think what two things here. So first of all, I think both parties can agree on tough carbon pricing. And both parties have agreed on some kind of a dividend that is then redistributed from carbon pricing to people, right? There are differences in how big this, how much of this, the income of the carbon taxing should go back, carbon pricing should go back into the pockets of people, and how this is going to be organized. But I think like the general idea of carbon pricing and then redistributing the income of that to people is one that the Greens and the FDP can agree on. I think the big question between them is whether the FDP is willing not to only do carbon pricing, because that would require an amount of adjustment if you really take it seriously from the side of business, that it's quite unlikely that like a pro-business party would actually be willing to stem. But I think that on an ideological level or like an ideas level, the parties can agree on that principle, yes.
Okay, thanks very much. I'm going to take it as the chair upon myself to ask the very last question before we wrap up. And that is a very simple one. So answers in very short, snappy answers, please. Rainer said that the new German government's attitude towards the UK would not change. Hardly surprising for those of us living up here. Now, but how would the new German government view Scottish independence and related application by an independent Scotland to rejoin the EU or to join the EU?
I think any new government would hope that the question will never land on their doorsteps.
Thank you.
But if it would land on the doorsteps, I think that this would be, a really difficult topic to deal with, because of course it raises so many questions, not only the Catalans and, Italy, Bavaria, I mean.
Bavaria, yeah, of course.
Yeah. No, but take it serious, because of course we know, the drive in Scotland, and we know the interest, and we know how Scotland voted. So, I think there is no answer that one can give at this point in time.
What do you think, Nina? Because you wrote a Brexit blog for the Böll Stiftung, so you're completely up with this topic.
Well, I think the new government would definitely want the UK to rejoin the European Union and never have this topic come up again, and realize that the fuels crisis shows them that they should definitely go back to the European Union as soon as they can. Yeah, I think that's on the one hand. I definitely think it's a question that the Scottish the Scottish population has to solve. I think it would be a mistake for the German government and the European Union to meddle in. I think it's something that obviously is at stake for the Scottish citizens themselves. I mean, the European Union stores were open 2017 in case Scottish independence had happened, and I would assume that something like this could be possible. But I mean, yeah, I personally would prefer the UK to definitely come back to the European table.
Okay. Right.
Agree.
Yeah.
I agree with Nina's last sentence with a qualification. As long as there's no exception rule, there's no longer a Margaret Thatcher I want my money back rule in the European Union. Otherwise, I totally agree with what Rainer said about this question. Nobody really wants to have this at their doorsteps here in Germany. And my personal advice to all of you in Scotland would be kick the Tories out of Westminster and make a huge campaign to rejoin the European Union within 10 years.
Yeah, well, with the current, if the opposition in Westminster is going to be the Labour Party, well, I'm afraid they're not exactly, knocking on the door of the Bellymore right this minute, or the anyway. So we shall have to leave that to another day. Look, thank you very much, all four of you, for agreeing to take part and for taking part in a very lively and open way, and addressing all the all the topics which have come up, and actually producing a lot of very interesting insights and things which personally I haven't heard, I haven't read, even in the kind of distinguished German press. So you've all been extremely helpful, and I'm really grateful to you for giving up your time this evening and for taking part. So if we could, we'd give a great huge round of applause to you. So all four of you, thank you very much indeed. Now for the rest of it, for us, I think you will see at the end of the session, I think, about giving some feedback, and also maybe even if you've got any spare dosh, you haven't been able to fill up at the petrol pumps because they're all closed. You can make a little donation to help fund this, and there will be details too, I hope, of the next webinar we'll be holding, which is on the 14th of October, and it's going to be on a very hot topic indeed, which is going to hot up again over the next few weeks, which is the future of the Northern Ireland Protocol, and with that, to some extent, or well, more than some extent, the future of the Stormont government, and also the future of the island of Ireland. So that will be on the 14th with John Bruton, the former Taoiseach, and Katie Hayward, the professor at Queen's University Belfast and the great expert on this, chaired by our old friend Kirsty Hughes. Anyway, so thanks to the panelists. Thank you very much to Berlin.
Thank you.
Thanks very much to Munich. And we hope to see you again sometime soon. And good luck with your formation of the, well, we're all agreed, traffic light government. Okay, thank you. Bye-bye. Bye.
Thanks for having us. Thanks.
Indeed, you're very welcome.
All the best.
All the best to Scotland.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
That was great. You're very free to leave, free to go for appeals or whatever. Anyway, cheers. Thank you very much indeed.
Cheers. Bye, David. Bye.
Cheers, Andreas. Yeah, mach's gut.